My Lords, what was the freedom that we really felt the loss of during the pandemic and the associated lockdowns? I'd suggest it was, above all, the freedom of association and assembly. We didn't lose the right to speak out, we didn't lose the right to vote, we didn't lose the right to worship as we pleased, but we did lose the right to congregate in whatever combinations pleased us. And the freedom of assembly, it seems to me, rests fundamentally on the freedom of contract. People should be allowed to come to freestanding agreements one with another without the state interpolating itself and declaring those agreements to be void. This is a principle that, far from having been strengthened by our recent experience, appears to be abandoned the world over, in this country not least. We're subject, as so often, to trends from across the Atlantic. And this is happening on both sides of the aisle, as they say, on the other side. There's always been a chunk of, let's say, the identitarian left that has subordinated the concept of free contract to the imperatives of identity politics. All questions of freedom of association tend to be seen through this prism of whether some imaginary club would be allowed to exclude somebody on grounds of ethnicity. And, well, I suppose it's conceivable that such a thing could happen in today's age, but it does seem an odd way to determine a general principle. Hard cases make bad laws, and hard imaginary cases make particularly bad laws. But I'm more interested in the way in which the concept of free association and free contract is under attack from the right. I was very struck, for example, by we see the governor of Florida is talked up as a potential presidential candidate, and he, of course, bases a lot of his campaign on having kept Florida open and avoided the worst of the lockdowns. And yet, such is the nature of the culture war that he was passing laws in Florida outlawing vaccine mandates even on private property. And that seems to me a fundamentally illiberal thing to be doing. For what it's worth, I thought vaccine mandates were very difficult to justify. We now know that vaccines were very good at protecting you, actually very bad at preventing transmission, and therefore the case for state intervention was very weak. But be that as it may, surely an individual shopkeeper, say, or cafe owner or whatever, is allowed to require whatever terms he or she wants from his or her customers. If they say you can't come in here without wearing a mask, or indeed we won't serve you without a tie, or you can't stay at this hotel with children or pets or whatever, surely that should be fundamentally a question of freedom and property. And yet, like so many of these trends, it's crossing the Atlantic, and we now, in this bill, are starting from the assumption that it's up to the government to determine things. And I just wonder, I'm going to leave the free speech stuff to, I see that my noble friends Lord Strathcarron and Leicester and Moylan are speaking after me. I'll leave it all to them. I've listened to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, in another place, and she says that all these things have been anticipated. She'd, I'm sure, agree with what the noble Lady Baroness Burt of Solihull just said about the amendments to prevent conversations becoming a source of harassment. But I just think there is a wider issue here. Shouldn't we be starting from the proposition that without a very, very good reason, it ought to be up to the employer and the employee to seek terms? I find it extraordinary, for example, that we're seriously discussing in this country at the moment whether there should be a statutory right to demand working from home or flexible work. I mean, you can do that now. What's to stop anyone saying to their employer, these are the conditions on which I would like and let's negotiate about it? The idea that we have to go to the government and get a sort of license to talk about these things strikes me as fundamentally incompatible with being an open society. And so I'd ask my noble friend the Minister, are we certain that we've exhausted every other avenue before we reach for yet further legislation? It seems to me a fundamental principle of a free society that if I want to work, let's say, for my noble friend Lord Roberts of Belgravia, and he offers me a job, and I'm happy with the terms of the contract, and so is he, that the government should not come between us and declare our arrangement to be illegal. If, for example, I say, look, do you know what, I don't care about paid holiday, I'd rather have a lump sum, that should be between us. Isn't that fundamentally a question of what we mean by freedom and property? And so please, will my noble friend the Minister reassure us that we have exhausted our arsenal. We have perfectly good old common law provisions defending the individual against harassment. We have perfectly good laws against incitement. They don't cease to apply in the workplace. Are we certain that we need this additional legislation, and that it isn't the worst kind of declamatory legislation, virtue signalling by law, because those invariably end up being the statutes that have the most unintended consequences.